It's the most wonderful time for retail companies. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm here with a highly requested video. I've had a lot of requests to do a video about overspending and wounded feminine energy. Now I have a video that goes into wounded feminine energy and addiction, and I think I probably touched on this a little bit in that video. So that goes into wounded feminine energy and addiction much deeper. If you're not familiar, wounded feminine energy is usually very self-abusive, self-destructive, tends to be very victimized, but it's also when there is like a wounding in your feminine where it's almost like your feminine energy becomes destructive to you. Feminine energy itself is very healthy in the same way that like masculine energy is very healthy. And it's healthy for anybody to connect to, both masculine and feminine energies. But we all have a core energy that's the one we're most ourselves in. So most women are going to feel the most comfortable in their feminine energy, but a healthy version of their feminine energy, and they're going to want to have access to a healthy version of their masculine energy. And for men, it's in the reverse. Most men are going to be the most comfortable when they are in a healthy version of their masculine energy most of the time, but they have access to a healthy version of their feminine energy. Unfortunately, either the masculine or the feminine can become wounded in anybody. So you can find this wounding in men or women. And really what it is often is when one of your energies, in this case I'm going to focus more on wounded feminine energy, when the wounded feminine energy, it becomes so strong and there's no access to a healthy version of the masculine energy to kind of help keep the structure. So masculine energy is the structure, feminine energy is the flow. Think about it like the masculine energy is the head, the feminine energy is the body. They're designed to work together, and that's within people and also like within couples. But when one of these energies becomes like overactive or is coming from a place of pain, trauma, wounding, and it becomes wounded, it can be very destructive. Wounded masculine energy tends to be very outwardly destructive. So that's when you usually find people to be more violent, and not violence to protect, but violence to abuse. Wounded feminine energy tends to be a little bit more self-abusive, but there's also some gray areas. Like if you are in your wounded feminine energy and you're abusing yourself, you can hurt other people in the process. So oftentimes this like wounded masculine, wounded feminine energy, there's some gray area as far as like who's the one who's actually being harmed. Usually wounded masculine energy, you're hurting other people, and you could in turn hurt yourself in the process. Wounded feminine energy is a little bit more often like you're trying to hurt yourself and you can hurt other people in the process. I mean, at the end of the day, healing is healing, and you want to heal from whatever it is that you need to heal from. But as I referenced in my video about wounded feminine energy and addiction, anytime you find someone in an addictive pattern, it is very often wounded feminine energy, because oftentimes addictions are self-harming. They're also ways for you to disconnect from yourself. So if you are, like, again, the feminine is the body, the feminine is feelings, it's emotions. So oftentimes people become addicted to things because they're trying to reject something going on in their body, their feelings, their emotions, and they use these addictions as a way to sort of like self-medicate or as a way to cope or to distract. Anytime you're doing any of those things in that addiction, it's a sign that you've wounded feminine energy. Also, addictions tend to be a lack of, and again, I'm not trying to diminish the concept of addictions, but if you have a lack of self-control, you have a lack of self-discipline, that's signs that you have no access to your healthy masculine energy, which healthy masculine energy is structure, discipline, self-control and things like that. Wounded feminine energy also shows up in, because the feminine wants to be filled, okay? If you think about the basis of masculine feminine dynamics, sexually, so to speak, the masculine is the one who penetrates and who releases. The feminine is the one who gets penetrated and is filled. And you think about that sexually, the feminine desires to be filled, and she wants to be filled with, love, sexuality. She wants to be filled with pleasure, food, anything. Like, she wants to be full. And the feminine in reality is never really truly full, okay? And that's, I go into this in other videos. If you fill up the feminine, like you fill up the feminine with love and you get her to the point where she has all the love that she thinks she wants, she'll just reach another level of like wanting more love. So that's kind of, unfortunately, and I've had a lot of pushback from this, but in reality, it's kind of the downfall of the feminine, is that we're never truly full. I mean, that's really, it's kind of the inevitable desire, because the feminine desires to be filled, the masculine desires freedom to release. In reality, the masculine's kind of like lot in life is that he will never feel as free as he wants to be. The feminine's sort of lot in life is that she will never truly feel as full as she wants to be. And that's just a reality that we have to accept. And that's honestly, that's the masculine and the feminine in all of us. I'm using he and she, but in all of us. You know, even in a woman, her masculine energy will never feel as free as she'll want it to be. In men, his feminine energy will never feel as full as he wants it to be. That's just, it's the nature of the masculine energy and the feminine energy. And the reality is, if we can just sort of accept that about ourselves, then, you know, we can usually live a happy, healthy life, right? But when that gets to be an obsession or it gets to be wounded, that's often when you start to get into wounded masculine or wounded feminine energies, particularly related to addictions. For example, and I've had a lot of pushback on some of the things I talk about, anytime you see drugs, alcohol, or something, and you're usually consuming those things to distract yourself from your feelings, distract yourself from your emotions, you don't have the self-control and discipline to regulate how much you're using these things, you're in wounded feminine energy, and that's for men or women. And I feel like the drugs and alcohol thing, I feel like that's something that shows up relatively evenly. I don't know the exact numbers, but it shows up relatively evenly in men and women. Wounded feminine energy also, I mean, it can show up in any way in men or women, but when it comes to men, and men are in wounded feminine energy, they're more likely to get into porn addictions, lust addictions, video game addictions, and things like that, which are more of like a coping mechanism. It's a way of dealing with things that they don't want to deal with. And those can vary, but it's like, it's lacking discipline, it's lacking self-control. Those can show up in women. It's not like women can't have those addictions, but they tend to be less common in women. It doesn't tend to be the way that women cope with what they're coping with, but it can happen. Wounded feminine energy in women more often shows up in overeating. That's a really common one. However, overeating in men is also wounded feminine energy, because if you think about it, if you're longing to be filled, like that's your desire, eating can give you that. It's a very superficial, but it can give you a feeling of fullness. And if you just feel like you just can never really fully fill yourself, you can have a tendency to overeat. I mean, that is a very common thing, and this can affect men or women. It's a little bit more common in women than it is in men. In fact, I go into this, I think, a little bit more in my wounded feminine energy and addiction. If you start getting into eating disorders of starvation, that usually is more wounded masculine energy. Even though it's self-abusive, it tends to be a little bit more wounded masculine, because it tends to be overly structured, overly disciplined. That's where it gets into a little bit of a gray area. But when you get into overeating, binging, things like that, what that typically is your feminine energy is become wounded, and it just constantly needs to be filled. I feel like when guys don't like what I have to say online, they just go to calling me fat and wanting to say that, well, you can't be obese and be feminine. Well, typically, and I mean, weight gain and things like that is a very complicated thing. And I am going to do a video, because I've had a lot of requests about how to sort of lose weight and get in shape, you know, while staying in your feminine energy. And I'm going to do a video on that probably like in time for the new year. But you know, guys will say things like, we can't be obese and be feminine. Well, actually, I mean, you can, but usually if your obesity is because of overeating, it's not always, but if it is, that's typically wounding in your feminine. That constantly needing to fill yourself up with food, usually you're doing it because you're either trying to distract yourself from things you don't want to deal with, you're trying to put up a wall to protect yourself, or you are over consuming because you feel an emptiness and you need to fill it up. Like, that's wounding in your feminine. And that can happen in men or women. I do think that that's a little bit more common in women. Eating disorders in general tend to be a little bit more common in women. Although they are increasing in men, that is something to factor in. Another very common way that wounded feminine energy comes out, and this is, I think, a little bit more common in women, but it can affect men, is overspending. And I had a lot of people that wanted me to talk a little bit about overspending and wounded feminine energy. And I figured Black Friday was a great day to talk about that. So this is something that, unfortunately, I have had to witness firsthand. So this is a pretty sensitive topic for me. Not myself personally, although I will be the first to admit, and probably most people out there, most people watching, can probably admit that we've probably in the past made poor choices with spending at some point in our lives. Maybe when we were younger, and maybe we got a handle on when we were older. Maybe when we were older and we made some choices maybe we shouldn't have, or things like that. Things like spending addiction, I think, are a little bit like the concept of like food addictions and things like that. You can never drink alcohol again and you'll be okay. Like, you can survive. But with something like food, like, you can't never eat again because you'll die. And with things like spending addiction, like, you can never not spend because there are things that you're going to need in order to survive. So it's the type of addiction that you have to give yourself a little bit of it because you need it to survive. You know, it's not like meth where you can live your whole life without having meth and you could live a long and happy life, right? One of the things that I've noticed, and unfortunately because I have someone very close to me in my life that has a really, really severe spending addiction, it's affected me and it's affected a lot of people close to me. It's difficult to talk about, and it's also something that when I make these videos, I don't really love to like share, other people's like personal details and stuff. So, it's not something I can really share completely because I want to respect people's privacy, but it is something that I've witnessed the devastation of extreme spending addictions. And this is beyond, like, I mean, if you think about it, sort of the stereotypical social media, like, woman thing to do is to like go to Target and to buy a whole bunch of stuff for your house and like do some decorating for your house and stuff. Decorations and decor and accents and things like that, like wanting to like beautify your space, as well as accumulating things, is actually very feminine energy. Feminine energy is very receptive. So even if you're giving to yourself, that's very feminine energy. The desire to sort of like have beautiful things around you and beauty and creativity and things like that, those are all very much feminine energy. So those things are very normal. I find that sometimes there are people who, when you mention spending addiction, and they're like, oh my God, well, I go to Target and buy a bunch of stuff, or like, ooh, I spent a little bit much money on Amazon, like, and that can start making people feel guilty. I want you to know that it's normal to do those things. Like, it's not abnormal. Obviously, if you're spending beyond what you can afford and you're getting yourself into debt, that's when it starts to become a problem, right? Like, that's when it becomes detrimental. And if it's actually like harming you or harming people around you, that's when you really have to be more concerned. So, I mean, if your like weekly Target trip or something is actually putting you into massive debt, it's something you want to look at, right? And I am not a financial expert by any means, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to spend your money, but I do think that can be a gateway to something more serious if you do find it to be compulsion. And I know there's kind of like the joke of retail therapy, and I get it. Sometimes like you're feeling down, you just want to buy something to pick you up. I get it. If it starts to become a crutch and you aren't dealing with the things that you need to deal with, or it's actually starting to harm yourself, or you find yourself needing to have so much stuff around you, like you're trying to like fill up spaces around you because you can't deal with the emptiness, that's often a sign that there's something lacking that you're needing to fill. I think most of us can probably relate to the idea that sometimes we overeat when we feel really empty. Not everybody does that, but it's a common thing, right? The spending addiction is a similar thing, right? Like you're feeling empty in some way, and your feminine energy, and it's feminine energy in anybody, is like, I need to be filled. So you'll fill yourself with whatever you feel like you have access to. And usually what it's a sign of is that you're missing something. Like you're missing something in your life, and maybe you need to fill yourself with more love. Maybe love for yourself right now, or maybe you need more friendships, or maybe you need more, if you are in a relationship, maybe you and your partner need more connection. There's different reasons. Obviously, every situation is unique, but that spending, the overspending, is very often connected to wounded feminine and the feeling of I need to fill myself up. Now, there are a lot of money issues. If you're finding yourself overspending but never having anything, right? Like that's usually if you're spending to accumulate stuff. If you're finding yourself spending, I would say even like sort of gambling addictions or things where you're finding yourself spending but you don't have anything and you're trying to get rid of that money, like you have to, it's like you can't, you don't feel like you can hold the money and you feel like you have to get rid of it quickly, that's a little bit different. I mean, I would still say that's probably wounded feminine because you're still operating from an addiction. It's probably, it's a lack of self-control, so it would be a deficiency in your masculine energy. My guess would be like you'd be getting that temporary adrenaline rush, the gambling and seeing if you get that hit, like you kind of like an adrenaline thing, which that can be tied to your wounded masculine as well. And now that I think about it, fight or flight is definitely more of a masculine thing. That's masculine energy in all of us, being in that fight or flight. The feminine doesn't do well in fight or flight. The feminine doesn't do well with the adrenaline rushes and stuff. The masculine is really more the area that is better with the fight or flight aspect. And that's the masculine and feminine in all of us. I'm thinking now about gambling addictions and how that could translate a little bit into both, but I would still say that addictive pattern is still probably more your wounded feminine. But yeah, if you're spending to accumulate, and especially, and I think that overspending can get tied to hoarding. They're not always the same. Overspending and hoarding can be related, but they're not always the same, because not everybody overspends and hoards, and not everybody that hoards is overspending. I mean, so they can happen separately, but they can very often exist together. If you are finding yourself accumulating and needing stuff around you all the time, again, that's usually that you are using that as a way to make yourself feel full, and there's probably something missing in your life that you are feeling an emptiness. That's really what you want to work on, especially if you're finding that your spending is getting out of hand. Like, it's getting to the point where you're, you know, finding yourself in debt, and it's starting to affect those around you. Overspending, I think, can also be like spending beyond your means to keep up with those around you, like to put on a show, to be more performative, which that can also be wounded feminine, because showiness, like being seen, being witnessed, is very much feminine energy. But if you end up feeling like that desperate need to be seen, so now you're spending way more money than what you have to have people see you, have people witness you, to be seen, like, oh, I'm gonna, let me, you know, buy these Louis Vuitton shoes and my Louis Vuitton bag, and maybe you can't afford those at all, but you need to be seen and witnessed and stuff. That can often be your wounded feminine, of feeling that desperate need for the attention and the validation. I mean, look, if you can afford these things and you want to buy something that really makes you feel good, and you buy yourself a great designer bag or a great pair of designer shoes or something, and it makes you feel like luxurious and abundant, and you have the money for it and things like that, like, more power to you. But if you're spending money on those things for the image, like, I want people to think I can afford Louis Vuitton, but you really can't, and you're trying to put on that facade, that's usually you looking for external validation for something that is very physical, and that's also your wounded feminine. The wounded feminine will also get desperate for validation from others and stuff, so that's also something that you want to look at. Like, again, these behaviors are complicated, and you might also want to look at, like, what is it that you're overspending on? Is it stuff for your home? Like, is it, say, you know, I mean, if you're, I mean, I get it. Like, there's the stereotype that women love to have a lot of pillows, right? Like, you know, I mean, that's decorative pillows and everything, and I'm not knocking that. I love pillows. I carry around my own. But it's, if you feel like you're constantly buying pillows, that might be a sign that there's a comfort missing in your life, and you're searching for it desperately in buying pillows or something like that, right? Are you buying luxury items that you can't afford? Is it because you really love these luxury items and they're making you feel good, or are you buying them for an external validation to be accepted by a group of people, or trying to fit in with a group of people that you don't fit in with, or a desire to be sort of accepted, or things like that? You know, I mean, I think sometimes looking at the thing that you're overspending on. Are you overspending on, like, gifts for other people, which again might be this sort of need for acceptance, or a sign of lacking self-control, or like desperately trying to win people over and trying to get love from somebody else by trying to win them over? I mean, that you're trying to get that external validation instead of actually, like, learning to love yourself. You're trying to get that love and acceptance from other people to try to get that to fill you up, as opposed to filling yourself with love. And I realize right now, you know, it's holiday time, people are spending. You know, I came out with a gift guide, and I try to recommend products to you, and I've talked about in other videos that I've had a lot of conflict in doing that, because again, I have witnessed how dangerous spending addictions can be, and I've had this inner conflict where, like, I want to recommend things to you that I think are really great, and, you know, I want you guys to know about products that I think are great and that I really love, but I've witnessed the spending addiction so closely and how detrimental it can be, so I go through conflicts about promoting things and things like that, because I know how dangerous it is, but I also know that, you know, there are things in life things that we need, and things that you want to find, like, you want to be good and you want to be quality. And I think that there's also things that sometimes we just want in our lives because they make us smile. And I don't want people to feel like they have to deprive themselves of, like, little joys in life, but you also want to keep an eye out for if it gets bad. If you start draining your savings accounts because you're out of control with your spending. And I know that can be really hard to see in yourself. You know, I mean, there's just little things that, you know, I've purchased that, you know, maybe even weren't that much money, but they just brought so much joy to my life. And there are things that I love, and I'll look at and I smile. And, you know, for me, I found that focusing on quality as opposed to quantity is really important. Like, I had a really inexpensive purse that I bought, and you know, it was a pretty cheap purse, and I used it for years. I loved it. It was so practical. It just worked with everything, and it was so, you know, it was like just the right size, and it just went with everything, and it just worked really well. It was really inexpensive, and it ended up falling apart. Now, I did get a lot of use out of it, but I decided when I went to get a new purse to replace that one, I went with one that was a slightly higher end purse. Pretty much the same size. It was a better quality material, and it was a bigger brand name, and I did spend money on it, more money than I would have spent on a purse. It's not a super high end. I mean, I did get a bargain on it, but it was an investment for me. But I said, you know what? Like, I want something that's going to last me longer. So I want to invest something in quality, but I don't need like 100 little cheap purses, because I found myself, when I did have a bunch of cheap purses, I was just using the one. So finding one like that was like a similar size and a similar color and style, but just upgrading the quality of it, for me, it made me feel a little bit more luxury, and it also was an investment in something of quality that I knew was going to last me a while. You know, I for sure have found myself, I mean, I used to spend ungodly amounts of money at Sephora when I was beauty blogging. It was one of the reasons I had to kind of transition out of beauty blogging, because it was just so much money, so much of an investment, and like, just there's so many things in our society right now that are perpetuating that overspending, that needing stuff all the time. I actually got to thinking about too, like, I mean, I'm about to turn 45. I don't even want to think about that. You know, so I grew up before social media, before you could just go online and buy stuff. And, you know, I think about how, you know, when I was growing up, like, you really, I mean, there was TV and movies and stuff, but you, and I used to obsess over like fashion magazines and things. But like, if I saw something in a fashion magazine that like wasn't at a store that was in like a certain mile radius of me, I just didn't get it, because like there was no way of getting it. Whereas now with social media and the internet and online shopping and things like that, like anything that's in front of you, you can get, you know, if you can, you know, scrounge together the money for it. I've seen it personally with people that like used to use for the kids watching. There was a time when in the newspaper, okay, let me backtrack. There was a time when people had newspapers. There was a time when like actually a paper boy would ride along on his bike, and he would have a whole bunch of newspapers on the front of his bike in a basket. And if you watch old movies, you might be able to see this. It's very nostalgic. And he would throw the paper on people's, and aim for people's doorsteps. And then people would come out and read the paper every morning. I know, some of you that are like my age or older are like, yeah, we know. And some young people are like, wow, I had no idea. That's how people, like, the newspapers were essentially like our social media. Like, that was how we found out what was going on in the world. And they used to have like classifieds in the newspaper, so people would decide to sell stuff, and like obviously you'd have to like put your ad in the classifieds that you were selling something and whatever, and people would have to see it, and there'd usually have to be a phone number or something, and you have to call the person, and there'd be interaction, you have to meet the person somewhere and whatever. It would be like a complicated thing. It was like the original Craigslist. So I think people that were inclined to like buy things from the classifieds, like some people would just, you know, like, oh, I'm looking for something, like I'm looking for a lawnmower, and this person's selling a lawnmower, let me go buy a lawnmower, or something like that. Craigslist like amplified that, but it was still usually pretty local, because people tended to be purchasing stuff that was a little bit more like local to them, so you'd have to like meet someone and get it. And then of course then there was the Craigslist killer, and that I think that kind of scared women away from that service and stuff, but like that was a little bit more like a mass classifieds type thing. Now with things like eBay and stuff, I mean, that's something that I've witnessed personally be really detrimental, is this obsession with, because you can get anything anytime, like right there at your fingertips online. I think a lot of people's spending addictions have gotten really out of control. Now granted, there's other addictions, porn addiction being one of them, and things like that, gambling addictions. I think with everything that's going on right now with, I mean, the fact that sports betting is not only like legal, it's like advertised constantly and everywhere. Like, I think you're gonna see a massive increase in people with gambling addiction problems. So there's so many addictions that the internet and social media and stuff are just making so much more rampant. But like, I know eBay is for sure one, and I'm sure there's a lot of other sites like it. Temu, I know of someone personally who had a serious Temu addiction. Temu, I don't know how you say it. And I've actually been hearing more people talk about this addiction to buying stuff there because everything is so cheap, so you can get like this like massive amount of stuff for like hardly any money, and it's that accumulation of stuff, and it's getting so bad. And, you know, I know people love to blame social media for everything, like their love life and their, you know, everything in life. And yes, social media has pluses and minuses for sure. But what it's really doing is it's amplifying some of these problems that would be in people anyway. So I don't really think that people are getting a gambling addiction or a spending addiction or a porn addiction from the fact that it's online or from the fact that it's social media. These things have always existed. These things have always been a thing, and people that have had an inclination to do these things have probably done these things to some extent before, or would find a way to do these things even if, you know, the internet and social media weren't a thing. That said, the internet and social media, well, I do think there are a lot of benefits to it. I mean, for God's sakes, I have my entire platform is on social media. So, you know, we can find information so much easier. You know, we can learn how to do anything. I mean, anything you need to do, you need to know how to do. I mean, I built my entire website Googling stuff on YouTube to figure out how to do things. You know, people have done home repairs just on tutorials on YouTube and things like that. Like, social media can be really beneficial. You can stay in touch with people that you may not have been able to stay in touch with before. I mean, there's so many benefits to it, but it can perpetuate a lot of negative patterns, wounding, and addictions in people that already have the inclination. Social media isn't causing these things. It's amplifying these things in people that already have these inclinations, and it is enabling them in a lot of ways. So somebody that has a spending addiction probably has that inclination anyway, but the easy access to online shopping and things like that are going to amplify that, because it enables them to be so much more destructive with their addictions. Sports betting being a much more common thing now. People were probably already gambling and already had that inclination to a gambling addiction, but now that it's much more accessible and it's becoming much more popular and mainstream, it's probably gonna get worse. Porn addiction has always been a thing for people, even before it was so readily available online. Before like social media and all that kind of stuff was a thing, I knew people that were porn addicts. Like, we didn't have a term for it back then, but I actually remember knowing a guy at one point who I remember meeting, and like I was just sort of like, this guy's clearly addicted to porn. And it wasn't even something that was like, the idea of someone being addicted to porn wasn't even like a mainstream idea at the time, but I remember being like, okay, this guy clearly has an addiction to it. And this was before it was even like common on social media. Like, you literally had to like buy videos and stuff like that in order to get access to those things. It's easy to blame things like social media and the internet, but that really just amplifies it. In the same way that like money is an amplifier. You know, good people that get a lot of money are gonna do good things with that money. Bad people who get a lot of money are gonna do bad things with that money. And that's just the way that it is. You know, because we know there are rich people who are good people. We know there are rich people who are bad people. There are poor people who are good people and poor people who are bad people. The money is really just an amplifier. And I think things like social media and, you know, online spending, online shopping and stuff. Now, that's not to say that, you know, people that are spending to try to keep up with other people in the validation or trying to sell you a certain lifestyle, you know, I'm not saying that they're not perpetuating it. They are. I would highly, highly recommend that you take everything you see on social media with a grain of salt, because a lot of people on there are just, they're like renting the designer stuff that they're sharing with you. I'm pretty sure there was actually a social media influencer who was like a designer, like he was promoting designer brands and designer labels, and supposedly he was actually like homeless and didn't own any of the stuff. He was like sneaking into designer stores, like taking pictures of himself, like trying stuff on in the store and then like just posting it, and he didn't actually have any of it and he couldn't afford any of it. I remember hearing that story. I don't remember who that was, but so yeah, like you gotta take everything you see on social media with a grain of salt. I do think it's an amplifier, but generally speaking, I would look at, if you are finding yourself in a spending addiction, I would look at like, what are you spending it on? When are the times that you feel like you need to be overspending? What is it in your life that you're either not acknowledging, not accepting about yourself, not being willing to deal with, or what do you feel like in your life is missing? What is the thing that you wish you had in your life that you don't? Because more often than not, I mean, any addiction really, but in this case talking more about spending addictions, it's usually a sign that you're trying to fill yourself, you're trying to fill your life with something that you're missing, and or there are things in your life that you need to deal with that you're avoiding dealing with. And dealing with those things, and also figuring out how to fill yourself up. I mean, it's great to spend money on like, you know, buying a whole pile of beauty products at Sephora. Like, I get it. I've done it before. It can feel good. But like, if you can't afford that, like, what about just like running a bath and maybe putting a little bit of Epsom salts in there, which are not that expensive, and like, would that make you feel like you cared for yourself and it would cost way less money and would probably feel more fulfilling? Like, how can you fill up your life in healthy ways that don't cost as much money? Or figuring out how to fill up your life with something that's quality. Like, is, you know, buying, you know, 100 handbags that you may not use just so that you can say you have 100 handbags. Like, is that gonna feel as good as you maybe investing in like a really great handbag that you really love? You know, because at the end of the day, the price will probably be similar, but which one will make you feel more fulfilled? You know, it's like if you're craving a steak and you decide to like chew on steak flavored gum or something, is that really, you're still gonna want the steak, right? But if you just let yourself just eat a steak, you know what I mean? And it will actually like fill you, that can be so much more satisfying. So sometimes like depriving yourself of what you really want and trying to like do it cheaply, but you overspend on the cheap stuff, like that can also be a way that you're not really truly fulfilling what you deeply need. So like asking yourself, like, what do I really need? Like, what do I deeply need at this time? I mean, I think, and this is more about spending, I have other videos talking more about eating and overeating, and I'm going to do a video talking about losing weight and getting in shape and stuffing your feminine energy. But you know, it's similar to, you know, if you find yourself overeating a lot, sometimes it can help you to stop and be like, okay, what do I really want right now? Like, do I want a big bowl of pasta or do I really want a hug? You know what I mean? Like, 'cause sometimes when you're craving, like, again, if you're like going out and you're buying all these like pillows and blankets and buying all this stuff for your home and you're like filling up your home with stuff, it's like, are you craving comfort? Like, maybe you need a hug. Like, maybe that's what you really need, you know what I mean? And like getting to what it is that you really need. And again, if you want to have pillows and you can afford to buy some pillows, go for it. Like, but if you're finding that that's spending, if it's a compulsion or it's just getting you in deeper and deeper debt, because, you know, people are really struggling financially right now, and I get it. It's asking yourself, what do you really need? Oftentimes too, the fear of scarcity, the feel of not having, the feel of, I mean, that scarcity is usually emptiness. So if you're like panic because you're like, oh my God, I don't know when my next paycheck is going to show up, or I don't have enough money to get me to the next paycheck, it's not logical, but sometimes our brain will go to like, oh my God, well, let's spend all the money that I have now on stuff that I want. And then you don't have any money left for the stuff that you need. You did that intentionally because you were kind of in that scarcity mode. And oftentimes when we feel scarce, our body goes into survival mode. And when our body goes into survival mode, we usually go to coping mechanisms. We go to like searching for comfort or searching for fullness in some way that we can. So how can you work on working through the things that you're dealing with, that you're trying to avoid dealing with? Like, how can you work on making yourself feel safe in your situation? And I understand that times are tough right now. Times are tough for a lot of people right now. So I'm not trying to diminish any of those things. My heart goes out to people who are struggling. I do, because I get it. I also would point out, and I think I've mentioned this in other videos, but I'm so glad that we have more resources and more help for people with like drug and alcohol addictions than we ever have before. I'm sure that there are areas to improve. There's more access to help in those areas than there ever have been, and like I think it's amazing, because I have known a lot of people whose lives have been destroyed, and you know, either directly through drug or alcohol addiction, or just, you know, because someone in their life had a drug and alcohol addiction. So I'm grateful for that. That said, there are so many other addictions that people are dealing with right now, and I do think that we're talking about them more. But I can tell you, as somebody who, when you are dealing with somebody who has a substance abuse, like non-drug or alcohol addiction, when you do try to get them help, there are very limited resources to get people help. I think especially with spending addictions. I've noticed that personally. I've sought it, you know, and I know that there are groups and meetings, but when you're dealing with somebody who's like in their addiction and they cannot accept that they are addicted, you know, you can't get them to go to meetings. You can't force them to go to meetings and force them to get help. I don't think that people really fully grasp, like, if you haven't known someone who, I mean, I'm in a situation where I'm dealing with somebody who is more in debt from spending addiction than most people will ever earn. Like, extreme cases. That doesn't just affect them, that affects people around them. And when you can't get them to stop, and when you can't Like, they can't see the problem. They manage to find other people that will enable them and things like that. Like, it's such a deep hole. And for family members, like when you're the next of kin or something, and you know that eventually this stuff is going to catch up to you. Oof. It's, I mean, overspending can affect anybody, but the more access that a person has to money, so the more that they have been financially privileged, the more damage they can do, which is why, and I know this is probably really controversial, I've always been very conflicted when people were like, free Britney and her conservatorship. Now, look, it may have not been handled well. You know, I'm not going to dive into all that and everything. However, I think a lot of people looked at the Britney situation as like, oh my God, if somebody tried to put a conservatorship on me and tried to control what I did, I wouldn't want that. I get that. But when you're somebody who's dealt with somebody with a severe addiction, especially somebody who is so bad with money, like people with access to a lot of money that are mentally unstable, especially people that have addictive tendencies, can do a lot of damage with that money. I'm not sitting here and saying that conservatorship is the answer. I don't really know what the answer is. Believe me, I've looked into it. I've looked into help for it, and I've looked into, yeah, I've looked into it, believe me. And I won't even get into how bad the situation that I'm dealing with is, because sometimes I tell people about it, like when I do talk about it, like to people like in life to see if I can get help, I feel like they don't believe me. Like, it's really bad. And I feel like the more it's something that, like, yes, when you're broke and you're overspending and you're in debt, like I'm not denying that that's bad. When you're dealing with somebody that had access to a lot more money, they can do a lot more damage with a spending addiction. So it is something that I do feel like can oftentimes harm people that are a little bit more in a better financial situation. And also, if you are someone who is in a slightly better financial situation, at least when you start your sort of spending addiction, the addiction doesn't show up as quickly, because, you know, if you're, you know, you're broke and you start overspending, you're gonna hit rock bottom a lot quicker. Whereas when you are in a better financial situation and you do start overspending, it's gonna take you longer to hit rock bottom. I'm not trying to play like the poor little rich people or anything like that, but like that is a difference. And the fact that there really is not like help, and particularly help for people who are also suffering, because it's very rare. Well, it's very rare that any addiction only affects the person who's addicted. It's almost always going to affect other people in the process. I can speak personally from dealing with somebody with an overspending addiction. It's incredibly detrimental. It is. And I wish there was more help for people, the people who are actually addicted and the people who are dealing with the addiction, like dealing with the person that has the addiction. You know, in the same way that I wish there was more help for, you know, people with porn addictions, people with gambling addictions. I mean, I know that there is more and it's something that's being talked about more, but I really think that we need more help for people with addictions, because I think these addictions are only going to get worse and they're only going to get more intense, partly with, you know, more and more social media and internet, and that does amplify it. It's not causing the addictions, but it's amplifying the addictions. But also too, like, as we go through strain and scarcity, and we're dealing with a lot of really, like, times are tough right now. I mean, times are really tough and really stressful, and oftentimes stress will also amplify these addictions. And the more that these addictions happen, you know, I mean, it's so destructive. It's so destructive to the person, it's destructive to the people around them and stuff. And so again, most of these addictions are very much connected to wounding in your feminine energy. To simplify it, healing your feminine energy, as well as also having a healthy connection to your masculine energy, which will be your self-control and your discipline and things like that. Healing your feminine energy of learning to connect to your body, to learn to accept the emotions that you are ignoring, to find fullness within yourself and not looking for external sources to fill you up. It's the first step. I mean, it's oversimplifying a very complicated problem, but I hope that those can help you. And I know that especially like this time of year with holiday time and everybody's shopping and there's sales, and it's like, oh my God, there's all this stuff, and you feel like you have to like accumulate stuff, or you have to buy stuff for other people, or it's spending, and you know, this is when retail stores want to make all their money, and we live in a very consumerist culture. I go into a little bit more about like consumerism and stuff in my video about being feminine and feminist. You know, we live in a very consumer culture, and we are programmed to consume things. And look, I've heard other people touch on this. This isn't my original idea, but I do think that there is something to the idea that, you know, capitalism is great. Like, I wouldn't want any other system, but capitalism also has to have a conscience. you know, it's one thing to exchange goods and services for, you know, money, and I think that's great. You want to have an exchange, right? I mean, you know, people provide you with a good or a service and you give them money, and like it's a great system. It's probably the best system anyone can come up with. But when you start having companies that are selling you things that are harmful for you, and then you get other companies that sell you the antidote, so to speak, or you get companies that are selling you things that you really don't need and that are really more like addictive for you and things like that. I sat through a lecture when I was in college about psychology behind like childhood toy companies and stuff, like children's toy companies, how, you know, toys used to be very like interactive. Like you get kids like, you know, blocks, things that you like, you know, you build things with like Legos and stuff. And then as toys started to evolve, where it's like, oh, you get this figurine that just does this one thing, and then you have to get another figurine that just does this one other thing. So like you have to spend more money and you have to buy more stuff, as opposed to having like a child's toy that like you can just do anything with, and you can be creative and you can play and you can use your imagination. Is they kind of started to take the imagination out of children's toys in order to market to sell you more things. Or you buy like a Lego set that only does this one, like you build this one thing, you build it, and then you gotta move on to buy another Lego set, as opposed to just like getting kids like a Lego set where you can like, you could build a house and then you take it apart and you can build like something else, or you can build a truck or a car. Like you can be creative and learn to build things yourself. Like that's more interactive and more stimulating actually to a child's mind. Whereas if you buy like some of these toys that like, oh, this does this one thing, and then the kid gets bored with that one thing and then they toss it aside and they gotta buy another thing that just does this one thing, it kills creativity. But it also, you need to accumulate more stuff, and like that starts in childhood. And I think as adults we can actually, you know, learn from that. Like, can we buy something, or can we invest in something that's actually going to fuel our creativity, or, you know, bring some kind of joy or something to our life, but isn't just going to be something that we're just going to like use, get bored with, toss aside, and then need something new. Just some thoughts. Again, I'm not against capitalism. I'm for it, but I do think that we have to look at like, what are companies, what are they selling us? Is it safe? Or is it something that is just, are they selling us something that's addictive just so that we will spend more money? I think once you take the ethics and the morality out of capitalism, or anything really, take the humanity out of anything, you're probably going to end up with a destructive system. So again, that's probably a whole other subject. But if you are finding that, you know, your spending's getting out of control, your shopping's getting out of control, you know, especially this time of year, it's normal. Don't beat yourself up, honestly. Like guilt, shame, beating yourself up is only going to make it worse. Look at the big picture and look internally. Ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing, how you can connect to yourself, and I think that's the first step to healing. Being aware that you have a problem is really the first step. And then just looking inside yourself, asking yourself questions. It might be tough questions, but asking yourself questions, and I think that's the path to healing. This was a requested video, and I just wanted to talk about some of this stuff. Again, I have, you know, gift guides and product reviews and affiliate links and things like that. So, you know, I'm not innocent in perpetuating some of this stuff, but I always want people to invest in things that, you know, like I feel passionate about, that I think that you really enjoy. And I never want people to spend money that they don't have. I never want people to go into debt or get in harm's way because of, you know, anything that they spent money on. I want to see us all live, you know, happier, healthier lives and to thrive. So yeah, if you do find yourself in an addiction, please, please, please know you are worthy of seeking help in whatever kind of addiction, even if it's just awareness or going to a meeting or something. I want to see you thrive. Please, if you recognize any of yourself in any of this video, please seek help. And I mean that in the most loving way. So yeah, this was a requested video. If you have any other video requests, leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts on this topic, let me know. Any engagement on this content really does help boost us in the algorithm so more people can, you know, get this message. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, again, leave a comment. Details to all my social media links will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.